Captain Jonas Ford stood at the threshold of the Izareth hive, his boots making a soft clink against the alien floor as he walked into the heart of the Korathi starship. The Korathi were a mysterious and ancient species, worm-like in appearance, their bodies covered in layered chitinous plates that shimmered with an eerie glow. They had been a subject of intense fascination for humanity ever since the first contact nearly a century ago. Known for their reverence of massive sacred sandworms, called Shai-Hulud, the Korathi were both feared and admired by the galaxy. Now, Jonas was about to meet them in person. As the Terran ambassador to the Korathi people, Jonas was on a mission of peace, one of many diplomatic efforts to bridge the gap between humanity and alien races. He had already interacted with dozens of species, each with their own quirks and traditions. But the Korathi, they were different. Their culture was deeply entwined with their reverence for these giant sandworms, which they believed to be divine beings that controlled the fate of their entire civilization. Jonas adjusted his utility belt, feeling the weight of it for the first time that day. His fingers lightly brushed the top of a small translucent container attached to his side. Inside was a creature from Earth, a small pet sand dragon named Scales. It was about the size of a large cat, with shimmering, sand-colored scales that made it almost blend into the environment. It had been bred on Earth as part of a scientific project to adapt desert species to the harsh conditions of other planets. Scales was harmless, affectionate, and completely unlike the creatures the Korathi worshipped. The moment Jonas entered the Grand Hall, a collective hiss echoed through the air, causing him to pause. The Korathi, standing in their towering, segmented forms, turned their multifaceted eyes toward him. The atmosphere was thick with a strange mixture of curiosity and suspicion. At the front of the gathering stood Elder Slarkor, the leader of the Korathi. His body was even larger than the others, adorned with ceremonial armor made from living organic matter. His long, sinewy arms were folded in a dignified manner, and his many eyes blinked slowly as he studied Jonas. There was a hint of both ancient wisdom and underlying wariness in his gaze. Human. Slarkor's voice boomed, reverberating through the chamber like a low-frequency hum. We have heard of your species, your bravery, your insatiable curiosity. But we have yet to understand. What is this strange creature you carry? The room fell silent, and every Korathi eye locked onto Jonas and his belt. Jonas swallowed hard. He had been briefed about the Korathi's reverence for the Shai-Hulud, but he had not expected such an immediate confrontation. I'm Captain Jonas Ford, he began, speaking slowly and carefully, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. This is Scales. He's a pet from Earth, a species we call a sand dragon. The term sand dragon barely left his mouth when the reaction was immediate. Several Korathi gasped, while others let out low hisses of disbelief. Their chitinous forms shifted, their attention now fully on Scales, who had perked up at the sudden shift in focus. The small creature hummed softly, its delicate wings fluttering. Miniature Shai-Hulud, cried one of the Korathi in the crowd, pointing at Scales, a sign of the great worm, here in our presence. Jonas blinked, confused. No, he's just a pet, he tried to explain, his voice edged with uncertainty. He's harmless, nothing like the Shai-Hulud you worship, just a creature we've bred on Earth. Slarkor, however, was not convinced. His eyes narrowed as he stared at the tiny sand dragon, and his voice, though deep, carried a tone of immense authority. Do you think us fools, human, to think that Shai-Hulud would take such a form? You mock us with this imitation of the divine. Before Jonas could respond, the crowd of Korathi started murmuring, their voices rising like a distant storm. Some began to chant under their breath, a haunting song that resonated in the very bones of the ship. Others reached for weapons crafted from living organic matter, sharp, jagged appendages that pulsed with deadly energy. Jonas's heart raced. This was not how the meeting was supposed to go. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his sidearm, though he knew better than to use it here. A fight with the Korathi would likely be a massacre, and diplomacy would be lost forever. Then, as if on instinct, Scales leaped from Jonas's shoulder, landing on the ground in front of Slarkor. The room fell completely still. Scales stood tall on all four legs, his tail twitching as he fixed his golden eyes on the elder. The humming sound from the small creature grew louder, vibrating the very air. Elder Slarkor tilted his head. The Korathi, normally so cold and calculating, seemed to hesitate. In the silence, Jonas could feel a shift, a tension that no human could easily decipher. The elder's many eyes flicked between Scales and Jonas. "Is this a sign?" Slarkor murmured. His voice was quieter now, as though considering something larger than the immediate confrontation. A message from Shai-Hulud. Jonas could only stand there, wondering if the presence of Scales had somehow triggered something ancient in the Korathi psyche. He had no idea how this would play out, but one thing was certain: this encounter was not going as expected. The atmosphere in the chamber had shifted dramatically. What had started as a formal diplomatic greeting had now spiraled into something far more dangerous. Captain Jonas Ford stood frozen, watching as Scales hummed softly in front of Elder Slarkor, whose many eyes studied the small sand dragon with an intensity that made Jonas's stomach tighten. The murmurs of the Korathi in the crowd had become a low, continuous hum. Some were whispering reverently, as though Scales were a divine messenger. Others hissed in anger, eyes narrowing with suspicion. The chamber, once filled with a peaceful energy, now felt charged with tension. Jonas knew that any wrong move could send the situation spiraling out of control. Slarkor took a step forward, his massive, segmented body shifting like the slow, deliberate movements of a giant worm. The elder's many eyes glowed with an inner light, focusing on Jonas. "You bring a creature before us that resembles the sacred Shai-Hulud. Tell us, human, why?" Jonas's mind raced. "It's not an imitation of your Shai-Hulud," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Scales is a pet from Earth, a creature we've genetically engineered for desert environments. It's just a pet, nothing more." But his words didn't seem to reach the elder. Slarkor's eyes flicked between Scales and Jonas, and then he turned to the crowd, raising one of his long, gnarled arms. His voice rang out, strong and commanding. "The human brings a creature that imitates our god. This is no simple animal. The signs are clear. Shai-Hulud has sent this messenger to us." The Korathi in the room gasped, their voices rising in a cacophony of excitement and awe. Some dropped to their knees, bowing before Scales, whispering prayers and praises in their guttural language. Others raised their weapons, still unsure whether this was an act of worship or a challenge to their authority. Jonas felt his pulse quicken. He didn't know what to do. The situation had escalated far beyond anything he had prepared for. The last thing he wanted was to anger the Korathi, especially after all the work that had gone into establishing peaceful relations. "Wait, please, listen," Jonas called out, raising his hands in a gesture of calm. "This is a misunderstanding. We didn't bring Scales here to mock your beliefs. He's just an animal, a creature from Earth. There's no connection to your god, I swear." But Slarkor was already speaking to his people, and his voice thundered across the chamber. "This is a test, then. A test of our faith. Shai-Hulud has sent us this sign. We must see if this human is worthy of the gift. We must honor the will of the great worm." Jonas's heart sank as he realized what was happening. The Korathi were no longer listening to him. They had already decided that Scales was some divine messenger sent by Shai-Hulud. This wasn't about diplomacy anymore. This was about their faith, and the human standing in front of them had just been made part of their religious trials. The elder raised his arms high. "Let the trial of the sacred sand begin." Before Jonas could even react, several Korathi moved swiftly, surrounding him and ushering him toward a nearby portal. He barely had time to glance back at Scales, who stood beside him, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding. The creature seemed content, its golden eyes shining brightly. The portal opened into a vast chamber, its walls lined with strange, living growths that seemed to pulse and breathe. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of the desert, strangely familiar and yet otherworldly. The ground beneath Jonas's feet shifted with a low hum, and for the first time, he realized he was standing on something far more ancient than any human could comprehend. The Korathi motioned for Jonas to move forward. Slarkor's voice echoed through the chamber. "This trial is to test your worth. You will survive the trial of the sacred sand, or you will be lost like the others who have come before you." Jonas felt the weight of the words sink in. This was not just a test of survival, it was a matter of faith for the Korathi. They believed that the trial would either prove him worthy or cast him out forever. Either way, his mission, and possibly his life, was hanging in the balance. He had no choice but to proceed. As he stepped forward, a loud rumbling shook the ground beneath him. The Korathi began chanting, their voices low and melodic, resonating through the chamber. The walls seemed to close in, and the ground cracked open, revealing a desert-like expanse beneath. Jonas looked down. The sand beneath his boots shimmered as though alive. He could feel the heat radiating from it. It was unlike any desert he had ever experienced on Earth. This was a world where sand was more than just a substance. It was a force of nature. Suddenly, the ground beneath him erupted. Giant sand serpents, creatures unlike anything Jonas had seen, burst from the earth, their massive jaws snapping shut in an instant. The Korathi continued their chanting, their eyes fixed on Jonas, waiting to see how he would respond. Jonas's instincts kicked in. He reached for his utility belt, fingers brushing the cool surface of his plasma rifle, but then he hesitated. The Korathi were watching. He couldn't use weapons. This was a trial of skill, and he had to prove himself without violence. Instead, he turned to Scales, who had followed him into the trial. The little sand dragon stood ready, its eyes glowing with a strange rhythmic energy. "All right, Scales," Jonas whispered, more to himself than to the creature. "Let's show them what we're made of." Scales hummed, its body glowing with a soft light as it leaked into the air, landing on the sand with grace. The giant sand serpents recoiled, sensing the creature's power. Jonas stood his ground, watching as Scales began to interact with the sand, calming the wild creatures around them. It was then that Jonas realized. This was no ordinary creature. Scales had a connection to the sand itself, something the Korathi would never have imagined. But would it be enough? Jonas stood frozen, his eyes wide as Scales glowed softly in the desert-like expanse, surrounded by the giant sand serpents. The creatures, with their sinuous bodies and jagged teeth, hissed and writhed, as if drawn to the energy radiating from the little sand dragon. The ground itself seemed to vibrate with tension, the air heavy with the scent of hot sand, and something ancient, almost alive. The Korathi continued their chanting, their voices a low hum that filled the air. Their eyes were locked on Jonas, watching intently. This was not just a trial. It was a test of faith. To fail meant dishonor, and Jonas knew that if he didn't succeed, he could lose everything: his mission, his life, and possibly the fragile peace between humans and the Korathi. Jonas took a deep breath. He could feel the heat of the sand beneath his boots and the weight of the Korathi's gaze upon him. He had no idea how he had ended up in this trial or why Scales was reacting this way, but he couldn't afford to fail now. The Korathi were a proud and ancient species. They didn't take kindly to outsiders who mocked their beliefs, even accidentally. "Scales," Jonas whispered, kneeling down next to his pet. The little dragon's golden eyes turned toward him, its body pulsing with a soft, rhythmic glow. It let out a low hum that seemed to resonate with the very earth. Scales wasn't just a pet. There was something far more powerful within it, something that was connecting to the very sands of this world. Jonas could feel it, too, a strange pull, as though the desert itself was alive and aware of their presence. The sand serpents, once wild and aggressive, began to slow their movements. They still hissed and snapped their jaws, But now there was something different in their eyes. Curiosity. They circled Scales, their massive bodies undulating with a kind of fluid grace that was both terrifying and beautiful. Jonas's heart raced as he realized that Scales was somehow calming them, controlling them with a power that was beyond his understanding. The Korathi watched in stunned silence. Slarkor, the elder, leaned forward, his many eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. "It is as though the Shai-Hulud speaks through it," he muttered, his voice filled with awe. Jonas's thoughts raced. What was happening? How was Scales able to do this? The little dragon was never meant to control anything this large, this dangerous. Yet here it was, its hum in perfect harmony with the sand and the serpents, as though it were part of this world, not just a simple creature from Earth. The ground shifted beneath Jonas's feet. The desert landscape seemed to breathe, shifting and undulating like the belly of a great beast. The air grew thicker, and the sand started to swirl around them, rising in small dunes that seemed to form shapes, patterns that Jonas couldn't understand. Was this part of the trial? Or was something more at play here? Then, out of nowhere, a massive roar echoed through the desert, louder than anything Jonas had ever heard. The sand beneath his feet trembled violently, and the ground cracked open in front of him. A massive form rose from the earth, something enormous, something ancient. It was Shai-Hulud itself, or at least the creature that the Korathi believed to be their god. The sandworm, the size of a small moon, coiled its vast, segmented body into the air, its enormous, gaping mouth snapping open as it rose to the surface. Jonas stumbled backward, instinctively raising his hands in defense, but the creature didn't attack. Instead, it hovered above them, its enormous eyes glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. The Korathi gasped in awe and fear. Some of them fell to their knees, bowing in reverence to the creature that had appeared before them. Slarkor stepped forward, his voice rising above the murmurs of his people. "The great worm has come. It recognizes the human. It recognizes Shai-Hulud and his companion." Jonas could hardly believe what he was seeing. The giant sandworm loomed above him, its massive form moving with the slow, deliberate grace of something ancient and powerful. He could feel its presence in his bones, a deep, resonating hum that seemed to speak directly to his soul. It was as though the creature was acknowledging Scales, as though it had somehow recognized the connection between them. The sand serpents, once circling Scales in aggression, now seemed to bow to the little creature, retreating into the sand with respect. The ground beneath Jonas's feet shifted again. But this time, it wasn't hostile. The desert itself seemed to calm, as though it too recognized something sacred in this moment. Jonas's mind was racing. What did this mean? Why was Shai-Hulud responding to Scales? He had never believed in gods or mystical forces, but here, in this moment, it was impossible to deny what he was seeing. Scales had some kind of connection to the sand, to the very heart of this desert world. And now, Shai-Hulud, the deity of the Korathi, seemed to acknowledge it. The Korathi were silent, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear, awe, and reverence. Slarkor stepped forward again, his voice steady but filled with wonder. "The trial has been passed. The human is worthy. The great worm has spoken." Jonas's mind was still reeling. He had no idea what had just happened, but somehow he had passed the trial. He looked down at Scales, who stood beside him, its golden eyes gleaming with a strange, knowing light. The little dragon had done something that even Jonas couldn't understand, but somehow it had bridged the gap between human and Korathi, between Earth and this alien world. For the first time since he had arrived, Jonas felt a sense of awe, not just for the creatures around him, but for the realization that humanity, with its curious and adaptable nature, could indeed connect with the most unexpected of beings. The vast chamber was still, but the air was thick with energy. The enormous sandworm, Shai-Hulud, loomed above Jonas, its ancient eyes glowing with a mysterious, deep light. The Korathi were in complete awe, their voices hushed and reverent, as they looked between Jonas and the great creature. Some knelt, their hands pressed to the warm sand in a silent prayer, while others stood frozen, waiting for some sign that this moment was real. Jonas stood motionless, his eyes wide in disbelief. He had come to this alien world with the hope of establishing peace, but now he found himself caught in something far larger than he had ever expected. The Korathi believed this was a sign from their deity. To them, the appearance of Shai-Hulud meant that the human standing before them, the one who had brought the sand dragon into their midst, was somehow blessed. The question was, why? Slarkor, the elder, slowly approached Jonas. His many eyes shimmered as he looked down at the human. His voice, though calm, held an unmistakable weight. You have passed the trial. Shai-Hulud has spoken. Your creature is a link between our worlds, between the great worm and your people. Jonas swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't understand, he said quietly, trying to keep his composure. Scales is just a creature from Earth. We never meant to claim any kind of connection to your god. Slarkor's many eyes focused on Jonas with intense scrutiny. You may not understand, but the connection is there. It is clear to us. The sand dragon you carry, Scales, is more than just an animal. It is an emissary, a messenger sent to bridge the gap between Earth and Shai-Hulud. The elder paused, his voice low but carrying through the chamber. You, human, are the one who has brought the sacred sand back to us. You and your creature. Jonas felt a chill run down his spine. The Korathi were serious. This was no simple misunderstanding. Scales had somehow connected with Shai-Hulud, and now Jonas was being seen as part of something far beyond his comprehension. He had come here to negotiate, to forge an alliance with the Korathi. But now they saw him as something more. The weight of that responsibility was pressing down on him, but he couldn't bring himself to reject it. Not yet. The massive sandworm's eyes blinked slowly, and the ground beneath them began to rumble again. The Korathi, in a mixture of awe and fear, took a step back, making room for Jonas. Slarkor raised a long arm, motioning for Jonas to approach the sandworm. This is a great honor, human, Slarkor said. Approach the great worm. Shai-Hulud wishes to speak to you. Jonas felt his heart race. He had never believed in anything mystical or divine. But now, standing before the ancient sandworm, he could feel something primal and powerful. The very air seemed to hum with energy as he moved forward, his boots crunching on the shifting sand. His hand reached out, hesitantly, as though touching the very heart of the desert itself. To his surprise, the ground shifted under his feet. A soft, warm breeze blew across his face, carrying with it the smell of sand and something sweet, like the desert after a rainstorm. He felt Scales move beside him, the little dragon's body glowing brightly, almost as though it were drawing strength from the desert itself. The sandworm's massive eyes locked onto Jonas, its vast, segmented body coiling around him in slow, deliberate movements. Jonas couldn't speak. He was caught between fear and awe, unsure of what to do next. It was as if Shai-Hulud were speaking to him through the very sands beneath his feet. Slarkor's voice broke the silence, his words like a deep rumble in the ground. Do not fear, human. The great worm does not harm those who are worthy. You and your companion have earned this moment. The bond between you and the great worm is real. Jonas's mind raced. He was here, standing before a creature that the Korathi believed to be their god, and he had somehow, unknowingly, formed a connection with it through Scales. What did it mean? What was he supposed to do next? Scales stepped forward, its small, graceful body moving confidently. The little dragon stood tall, its golden eyes now glowing brightly, as though responding to the sandworm. Jonas watched in amazement as Scales raised its head, its tail swishing back and forth. The hum it made resonated through the air, matching the deep rumblings of Shai-Hulud. The sandworm shifted slightly, as though acknowledging the connection. It raised its head high, and with a powerful, but gentle motion, it lowered its enormous body toward Scales. The smaller creature didn't flinch. Instead, it stood tall and proud, its eyes never leaving the massive sandworm. Then, to Jonas's surprise, the sandworm spoke, not with words, but through the ground itself. He felt the vibrations deep in his chest, a pulse that resonated with his very soul. It was as though the sandworm's thoughts were being transmitted directly into his mind. Human, the voice boomed, not in a way that could be heard, but felt. You have brought balance. Your species has touched the heart of the desert. The sands recognize you. The bond between your kind and mine is now forged. Jonas stood still, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. The voice of HFY wasn't just a sound. It was an experience, something that reverberated through his body and mind, as though he were connected to the very core of this alien world. Your species, the voice continued, has much to learn. But you are worthy. Together, we will build a future where the desert and the stars can coexist. The sands are your ally. Jonas's mind struggled to process the enormity of the message. The Korathi had always been a people of tradition and isolation, but now, it seemed, they had found something in humanity, a link to the sands, to HFY itself. Slarkor stepped forward, his voice softer now, filled with reverence. You have done it, human. You have bridged the gap between your people and the desert. This is the beginning of something great. The future of the Korathi and humans lies in your hands. Jonas glanced down at Scales, who was still glowing brightly, standing proudly before the sandworm. He could hardly believe it, but somehow, the little sand dragon had changed everything. Now, the future of humanity and the Korathi was in his hands. Jonas's mind was spinning. He had never expected to be caught in something so monumental. The ancient sandworm, HFY, had spoken to him, not with words, but through a deep resonance in his very bones. And now, as the chamber slowly quieted, he felt the weight of the Korathi's expectations on him. The future of both humanity and their people was now tied to what had just happened. The Korathi were silent, their faces filled with awe and respect. Even Slarkor, the elder, who had once been so stoic and commanding, now stood with his head bowed in reverence, his many eyes gleaming with something that almost resembled hope. For the first time since arriving on this alien world, Jonas felt like he wasn't just an outsider. He had become part of something much larger, something that transcended mere diplomacy. But there was a nagging thought in the back of his mind. As the moment passed and the giant sandworm began to retreat back into the earth, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that this connection, this blessing from HFY, came at a price. Nothing in the universe was ever truly free. Slarkor took a step forward, his many eyes narrowing with a new intensity. Human, he said, his voice low and measured, you have done what no other has done before. You have earned the favor of the great worm. But such power comes with responsibility. The bond between us is now sealed, but that bond, it requires something in return. Jonas's heart skipped a beat. What are you saying? He asked, his voice tight. The desert, Slarkor continued, is not a simple place. It is alive, as much as the stars themselves. The great worm's favor is not given without cause. You and your people must honor the desert, the sands, and HFY. If you fail to respect this bond, the consequences will be dire, not just for you, but for your world as well. Jonas felt a chill run through him. He had heard rumors of the Korathi's ancient beliefs, of their deep connection to the desert. But now it seemed they were more than just spiritual. The desert itself, the sands and the worm, had the power to affect everything, even across planets. How? How do we honor this bond? Jonas asked, his voice trembling slightly. What do you want from us? Slarkor's many eyes seemed to pierce through him, searching for some hidden truth. It is not just what we want from you, human. It is what you must offer to the desert. The sands will demand respect. HFY will not suffer disrespect, for it is the guardian of the desert, the protector of the balance. Jonas felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had come here to negotiate, to form an alliance between the Korathi and humanity, but now he was being asked to give something far greater. The bond between them was not just about diplomacy. It was about survival, about the future of both species. Before Jonas could respond, Scales, the little sand dragon, hummed softly beside him. It seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere, its golden eyes flickering as it stepped forward. Jonas looked down at the creature, wondering what it knew about this world and the bond it had somehow forged. Slarkor's eyes softened as he watched the sand dragon. The creature you carry is no simple animal. It is a guide, a messenger between your people and the desert. The bond between you and Shai Hulud has been forged through it. But know this, human, Scales is the key. What you do with this gift will determine the future of your people. Jonas's mind was racing. What did that mean? Scales wasn't just a pet. It was the key to the desert's power. The thought of that responsibility was overwhelming. But he knew he had no choice. He had already accepted this role, even if he hadn't fully understood what it meant. You will need to prove your worth, Slarkor said, his voice calm but firm. The Great Worm has granted you this blessing, but now you must show your commitment. You will go into the desert, deep into the heart of the sands, where no human has ever gone. There you will face the trials of the true desert. Only then will you prove that your people are worthy of the bond we have shared. Jonas felt a wave of dread wash over him. The trials of the desert were legendary. Even the Korathi feared the deep sands, where the ancient forces of nature could overwhelm any who were not prepared. But there was no turning back now. He had already accepted this path. Do you accept? Slarkor's voice boomed, his eyes fixed on Jonas with an unblinking intensity. Jonas took a deep breath. His mind flashed back to the moment he had agreed to come to this world, to negotiate peace, to find a way to unite humanity with the Korathi. He had never imagined it would come to this, to stand before the Great Worm, to be asked to prove humanity's worthiness through an ancient trial. But there was no choice. Jonas nodded slowly, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his chest. I accept. The moment the words left his mouth, the ground beneath them rumbled again, as though the desert itself had heard his vow. The sand shifted and swirled, rising up in towering dunes that seemed to form a path stretching out into the distance, a path that led deep into the unknown heart of the desert. This is the path, Slarkor said, his voice quieter now, filled with a strange, reverent tone. Walk it, human. Walk it with the sands, and let the desert judge you. Jonas glanced down at Scales, who was humming softly, its small body glowing with an almost otherworldly light. The bond had been made. Now it was up to him to face the trials of the sacred desert. With one final look at the Korathi, Jonas stepped forward, his boots crunching in the soft sand as he began the journey into the heart of the unknown. The sand stretched endlessly before Jonas, its vastness swallowing everything around him. The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of dry earth and salt. Scales, his small sand dragon, walked beside him, its golden eyes glowing faintly in the dimming light of the desert evening. They had been walking for what felt like hours, though Jonas knew it had only been a short time since he had stepped onto the path leading into the heart of the desert. The Korathi had told him little about what awaited him. They had only said one thing clearly: the desert would test him. And when the desert tested someone, it did so harshly. There were no guarantees, no promises of success. The only thing Jonas knew for sure was that he couldn't turn back. The temperature had dropped, but the air still felt thick, as though the desert itself was watching him. The vast dunes around him seemed to shift and change shape, making it feel as though the world was alive, shifting beneath his feet. Every step felt heavier, the sand pulling at his boots as though it wanted to swallow him whole. Scales hummed softly, its tail swishing in a rhythmic motion. Jonas looked down at the small dragon, who seemed unbothered by the desert's harsh conditions. The little creature had a confidence about it that Jonas didn't share. In fact, he was beginning to feel a strange sense of foreboding, a tight knot in his chest that grew with every step. What was he walking into? What did the desert want from him? The path ahead was winding and unclear, but Scales moved forward without hesitation, guiding Jonas through the dunes. As the light began to fade, the sky above them turned from orange to deep purple, and the stars slowly began to appear, glittering like diamonds on a dark velvet cloth. Suddenly, the ground beneath Jonas's feet shifted. He stumbled, caught off guard as the sand buckled and rose. The wind picked up, swirling around him in an unnatural way. He looked around, trying to see what was happening, but the sand was moving too quickly, too violently. It was as though the desert itself was alive, and it had decided to strike. Before he could react, a massive sandstorm erupted, sweeping across the dunes with terrifying speed. The air became thick with sand, making it nearly impossible to see. Jonas shielded his face, but the stinging grains of sand found their way through his clothes, cutting into his skin like thousands of tiny knives. He could hardly breathe, the sand suffocating him, filling his mouth and nose with its coarse texture. "Scales!" he shouted, but the wind howled so loudly that his voice was lost. He reached out, hoping to find the little dragon, but the sandstorm made everything a blur. He could feel the sand swirling around him, its weight pressing down on him, as though trying to bury him alive. He stumbled, trying to stay on his feet, but the wind knocked him off balance. His feet slipped in the shifting sand, and he fell hard to the ground. Panic set in. Was this the trial? Was this how the desert would test him? He had heard stories of people who ventured into the desert and never returned. Was he going to be one of them? But then, through the chaos of the storm, Jonas felt something, a small warm glow beside him. It was Scales, the little dragon, glowing brighter than ever. The dragon's hum grew louder, almost as though it were singing, a soft, soothing melody that cut through the roaring wind. Jonas looked up, and through the swirling sand, he saw Scales standing tall, its golden eyes gleaming with determination. "Scales!" Jonas gasped, his voice barely audible. "How are you?" But before he could finish, the sandstorm suddenly stopped. The wind died down in an instant, leaving only the eerie silence of the desert. The air was thick with dust, and Jonas felt as though he were in a dream. The sand, once violent and angry, was now calm. The sky had shifted again, the stars twinkling brightly above them. Jonas took a shaky breath and pushed himself to his feet. His clothes were torn, his skin scratched and bruised from the storm, but he was alive. He looked around, searching for any sign of what had just happened. The path was still there, winding ahead, but now there was something different about it. Something welcoming. Scales had stopped humming, but it was still glowing softly, its golden eyes watching Jonas with an almost knowing expression. The little dragon had led him through the storm, protected him in a way that Jonas couldn't quite understand. It was as though Scales knew exactly what to do, as if it had always known. Jonas took a deep breath and started walking again, his steps more confident now. The desert had tested him. It had thrown a storm at him, a test of endurance and strength. But Scales had guided him through it. Jonas didn't know how or why, but somehow he felt a deeper connection to the little dragon than ever before. They walked in silence for a while, the desert around them still and quiet now, as though it had accepted Jonas's presence. The path ahead seemed to lead them toward something important. Jonas didn't know what it was, but he had a feeling that whatever came next would be the real trial. The storm had been just a beginning. Scales looked up at him, its eyes gleaming. Jonas smiled faintly, his heart still racing from the storm. The little dragon had been his lifeline, guiding him through the chaos. He couldn't help but feel a sense of awe for the creature, who seemed to be so much more than he had ever realized. The desert was no longer a place of fear. It had become a place of challenge, of growth, and of understanding. Jonas had taken the first step, and now he had to continue. Whatever awaited him in the heart of the sands, he would face it with Scales by his side. And somehow, he knew, they would make it through together. The desert stretched out endlessly before Jonas, the dunes rising and falling like the chest of a great beast breathing in the still night air. Scales walked by his side, its soft, golden glow lighting the way. The trials of the desert had not yet ended. The sandstorm had passed, but Jonas knew it was only a taste of what lay ahead. He had to keep moving forward, for the Korathi, for his people, and for himself. As they continued on, the path seemed to twist and turn in ways that made Jonas question if he was walking in circles. The stars above were dimming, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. The sand beneath his feet felt different now, softer, more alive. The air had a strange weight to it, almost as if it were thick with magic or power, waiting for something to happen. Scales, Jonas whispered, more to himself than to the creature. The little sand dragon looked up at him, its golden eyes meeting his with a knowing look, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Jonas didn't know what to expect, but he felt as though the creature had been leading him toward something important all along. The sand was alive here. He could feel it in the way the grains shifted beneath him, like the desert was breathing. Suddenly, the ground before them began to shift. The soft sand gave way to hard rock, and before Jonas knew it, he was standing at the edge of a vast, open pit. The sight took his breath away. Deep within the earth was a vast cavern, stretching down so far that Jonas couldn't see the bottom. The walls of the pit glowed faintly, casting an eerie light across the scene. It was as though the heart of the desert had opened up before him. This is it," Jonas murmured, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the heart of the desert, the place the Korathi had spoken of, the place where the true trial would take place. Scales stepped forward, its small body glowing brighter as it moved toward the edge of the pit. The little dragon seemed unafraid, its golden eyes locked onto the dark abyss below. Jonas hesitated for a moment, but then followed, stepping carefully to the edge. The cavern stretched out beneath him, and he could feel the pull of something powerful deep inside. He had been chosen, and now he had to prove his worth. The air around him began to hum, and the sand beneath his feet began to shift once more, swirling in a pattern that seemed to form symbols. Jonas stared at the patterns, trying to make sense of them. They looked ancient, more like a language than a design. Scales hissed softly, almost as if it were speaking to the desert itself. The hum grew louder, and suddenly a voice, deep and resonant, echoed from the depths of the pit. "Human, you have come." Jonas froze. The voice wasn't spoken aloud, but rather was felt, a deep vibration that resonated in his chest. He turned toward Scales, unsure whether the voice was coming from the little dragon or the desert itself. But Scales wasn't moving. It was standing perfectly still, its golden eyes now glowing so brightly they almost seemed to be burning. "You have been chosen." The words echoed through Jonas's mind, making his head spin. He didn't know what to do, or even what this meant, but he couldn't turn back now. He had already passed through the trials of the storm, faced the harshness of the desert, and walked the path into the heart of the sands. He had to finish what he started. "Prove yourself, human," the voice continued, "and earn the right to walk the desert as one with the sands." Jonas swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. He stepped closer to the edge of the pit, looking down into the darkness. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble, and the sand swirled at his feet, forming a spiral pattern that led down into the abyss. "What do I need to do?" Jonas asked, his voice barely a whisper. His heart was racing, and he felt the heat of the desert all around him, even though the night air was cool. "The desert demands respect. The great worm demands respect," the voice replied. "You must face the test of the sands. Only by proving your strength, your will, and your respect for the desert will you gain the right to claim the bond forged between your people and the sands. Jonas closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He could feel Scales beside him, its presence a steady reassurance in the face of the unknown. He had come here to make peace with the Korathi, but now, it seemed, he was being asked to prove something much more. He wasn't just representing humanity anymore. He was representing the very bond between Earth and this strange, ancient desert world. "All right," Jonas said, his voice steady. "I'm ready. I will prove myself." The ground beneath him shook once more, and the swirling sand began to form shapes, visions, perhaps. He could see images of the past, of ancient beings standing on the same desert sands, offering their respect to the Great Worm. The symbols in the sand shifted, and Jonas realized they were forming a pattern, a challenge for him to understand. The desert was testing him, asking him to learn, to adapt, and to honor the powers that had existed long before he arrived. Suddenly, the sand surged upward, forming a massive twisting column that reached toward the sky. At the top of the column, Jonas saw something shimmering, a strange golden light. It was the heart of the desert, the heart of Shai-Hulud. If he could reach it, he would prove himself worthy. With a deep breath, Jonas stepped forward, Scales by his side. Together, they began to climb the shifting sands, the trial of the desert unfolding before them. This was it, the final test, and Jonas knew that the future of both his people and the Korathi rested on the outcome.